After the time of Darius, there was a king in Persia and Babylon named Xerxes. Not all the Jews in captivity had chosen to return to Canaan with either Zerubbabel or Esther. Many of them still lived in Persia. In the 3rd year of his reign, Xerxes gave a great feast for the officials of his court in the garden of his palace. There were beautiful decorations all about the palace. The people at the feast drank out of vessels made of gold, and the occasion was one of great celebration. At the same time, Vashti, the queen, gave a feast for the women of the palace. On the seventh day of the king's feast, Xerxes sent for his wife, the queen Vashti. He commanded her to come with her crown on her head and without her veil, so that everyone might see how beautiful she was. This was a very strange thing for a king of Persia to ask, because the women of the land in that time were never seen publicly without veils to cover their faces. They even lived in a separate part of the house and never appeared before men. It was considered immodest for a woman to let her face be seen by anyone but her husband. When the king Xerxes told Vashti to come before the crowd of princes and people of the land so that they might see her face without its veil, she refused to obey her husband's command. The king was wildly angry at this. He asked his wise men for advice. "Queen Vashti has not obeyed the command of the king, her husband," said Xerxes. "What shall we do to punish her suitably?" "Queen Vashti has done wrong," the wise men replied. "Now that she has publicly disobeyed her husband, all the women of Persia will think they can disobey too. This act of Queen Vashti is a very bad example to the other women of the kingdom." "But what shall we do?" asked the king. "Let us make her punishment severe enough so that the other women of Persia will not be tempted to disobey their husbands," said the wise men. "Let it be known that Vashti will never again come into the presence of the king, and let the king choose for himself another wife, one who will obey her husband as a wife should." This advice pleased the king and his princes, and he did as the wise men had suggested. He wrote the decree the wise men had advised and made it part of the law of the land. Now Vashti could never see him again. Then the advisors made another suggestion. "We think it would be a good idea if your majesty sent officers throughout the kingdom to gather all the beautiful women together in the place of Shushan," they said. "The one who pleases your majesty most out of all the beautiful women in Persia can be made your queen instead of the disobedient Vashti." "This is a very good suggestion," said the king, and he ordered his officers to go throughout the kingdom as the wise men had advised. One of the officials of the palace of Xerxes was a Jew named Mordecai, and he had a very beautiful cousin named Esther. Esther's mother and father had died, and Mordecai had taken the young girl into his own house and had brought her up as his daughter. When the time came for the beautiful young women of Persia to be assembled at the palace, Esther was among them. The officer of the king who had charge of attending to the needs of the women was very kind to Esther, because her charm and beauty pleased him greatly, and he assigned her to the best part of the house where the women stayed. He also gave her 7 maids to wait on her. Just before Esther went to the palace, her cousin Mordecai gave her a word of advice. "It is not wise to let it be known that you are a Jewess," said Mordecai. "Very well," Esther agreed. "I will not mention it." When King Xerxes saw Esther, he lost all interest in the other women. Esther was so lovely that he fell in love with her on the spot. He placed the crown on her head and made her his queen instead of Vashti. He then held a great feast for her, called Esther's Feast, and his attendants were all given presents in her honor. Esther remained obedient to Mordecai, even though she was queen, because she felt toward him as a daughter feels toward her own father. After Esther had been queen for a short time, she had a chance to do the king's service, and it was her cousin Mordecai who gave her the opportunity. There were 2 officers of the king who were angry at him for something, and they plotted together, planning to kill him. Mordecai was a watchman at the king's gate, and he overheard the talk about their plot. Promptly, he went to see Esther. 2 men are plotting to kill the king, he said. You must warn him. Esther told the king, and when he checked on the story, he found that the 2 officers were guilty. He had them both put to death for their treachery. Mordecai's action in reporting the plot was written down in the book of records, where important incidents in the history of the kingdom were noted.